It's me, Bobby Friction. This is BBC Radio London. And I'm really happy to say we're going to be talking now about a new documentary called In Search of Bengali Harlem. It's going to be shown at Rich Mix next week, which is very fitting because if you had to pick the Bengali capital of the United Kingdom, you'd probably pick the area around Rich Mix. And this documentary tells the decades-long story of the Bengali community's integration into Harlem. So this isn't just New York, it's specifically Harlem. And as we know, Harlem, famous for the African-American community there in New York. And this documentary is all about the way black and brown people found each other in New York. It follows Alaudin Ullah, who was growing up in 80s Harlem during the revolutionary pulse of hip-hop, which, as we know, really emanated out of New York during that decade. And he was listening to that while struggling to connect with his Muslim Bangladeshi parents and heritage. You get to see the vibrant lives that black and brown people built together in the cities and the neighborhoods they share. And I also, I'm going to say this again, I think there's some very instructive parallels between this documentary and what happened in New York and what's happening and what has happened in London as well. Vivek is the director, and he's also the author of the critically acclaimed Bengali Harlem and the Lost Histories of South Asian America. He's also the Associate Professor of Comparative Media Studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT for short, and he joins me right now, live from the United States of America. How are you doing, Vivek?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So let's jump in straight away, Vivek. There's so much of your other work I could talk about for hours, in fact. But let's talk about this specific documentary. Now, I've already talked about how it's being shown for the first, it's kind of like its proper London first showing at Rich Mix. Rich Mix is literally, minutes away from Brick Lane, from Aldgate East, all those Bangladeshi heritage, communities living in London. Talk to us about what your documentary is about. And kind of give us an idea about the parallels between those two cities, New York and London.
Yeah. Well, maybe the best way to start is just by telling a very short story of when I first moved to New York City in 1988. I was in my early 20s. Within the first month or so, I came across this tiny Indian restaurant in the heart of Harlem on 125th Street. And I went in, and it was run by an African-American woman who I later found out was named Ruth Ali. And there was a picture of her deceased husband up on the wall. And he was a Bangladeshi, when he came to the United States, he came from colonized East Bengal. So a Bangladeshi man, picture up on the wall, but the restaurant itself was being run by an African-American woman from South Carolina. And, later I discovered that same tiny restaurant was a regular spot for Miles Davis, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Morgan Freeman, Cicely Tyson, and even members of Malcolm X's circle, right? And it had been there since the 1950s, which suggested that it was probably one of the earliest Indian restaurants in New York, if not in the U.S. So how was it that one of the first Indian restaurants in the country was in the heart of the African-American community in Harlem, 2 blocks away from the famous Apollo Theater, right? So that question will be answered by the film. And the film really stems from my meeting about 10 years after that with Alaudin Ullah, who's my collaborator and the co-director of the film. And within 2 minutes of our meeting, he just said, I want to make a documentary about my father. And he told me about his father, how he had come from Noakhali, which is in present-day Bangladesh, and came to New York on a ship in the 1920s married a Puerto Rican woman and moved to Spanish Harlem. And what was really striking about that is that the United States, from the 1880s through the 1920s, was passing one after another anti-Asian immigration law, right? Mm-hmm. So started with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, and then that was renewed, then it was made permanent. Then in 1917, it was expanded to include India and other parts of Asia. So Alaudin's father's story just really stood out, because everyone assumed that after 1917 there was no more immigration from the Indian subcontinent. So I, of course, said, yes, let's make this documentary. And as I started to look in the archives to try to find a history to explain how Alaudin's father got to Harlem in the in the midst of the Asian exclusion era, it was just like peeling an onion. It just got more and more and more interesting. And I found that there were more and more and more men like Alaudin's father who had come to New York in that time.
Yeah.
What eventually became clear was that they were part of a population of ship workers on British steamships who were working under horrendous conditions on those ships. And I discovered through other historians, such as Rosina Visram in the UK, that in fact there was a long history of men who would sign on ships in Calcutta and then whenever they would jump ship in London and other British ports. And I found that this was also going on in New York City.
Mm. Well, I mean, just in terms of my anecdotal evidence, I'm British, I'm Sikh, I'm Punjabi, and anything pre-1950s, when it comes to Sikhs, which is usually California or Canada, same situation. Yep. Whole communities of men, just men, who married into the local Latin community, and now you've got these whole kind of ripples in terms of culture and whole, family trees, which are essentially half Sikh, half Latino. So this seems to be something that was very common at the time, and I'm sure questions like that will probably get answered in your documentary. Just a question about London and New York.
Yeah.
You know London very well. You've made documentaries about the Asian underground and the music scene in London in the 90s. Do you see parallels between the Bangladeshi community in London and New York?
Oh, definitely. Mostly because it was the exact same population working on the same ships. I think 2/3 of British merchant ships were going in and out of the port of Calcutta throughout the mid-20th century, early 20th century. So it was the same men from the same villages signing on to the same ships that were jumping ship either in British ports or in New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, on the other side of the Atlantic. And some men went back and forth, and over time, a lot of them went back to their villages, but those who stayed in East London, originally around the Docklands and then into Tower Hamlets area, often in that very early generation, married working class white British women from those neighborhoods and settled there. Whereas in the very same, era, the men from those ships were marrying into Puerto Rican and African-American communities in New York. So, and in both cases, some of the very first Indian restaurants, both in London and in New York,
were started by these men who had jumped ship. Wow. Also, look, I know you love music. As I said, you've made documentaries about music before. There's so much music to unpick. I mean, any mention of Harlem, you have to mention the music. Does the music get a look in the documentary? Well, in the sense that from very early on in the project, I approached a friend of mine, Vijay Iyer, who in those days was sort of just starting out as a jazz musician in New York. And I approached him to do the music for the film or be involved in the music for the film because his own music was really deeply rooted in Black music, in jazz tradition, and in, Afro-Caribbean music, etc. But also he drew on certain kinds of South Asian musical styles and phrases in ways that were really deeply integrated into what was essentially Black music that he was playing. So I was very lucky that he agreed, and over the years that I was working on the documentary, as his star rose, he never went back on that. And so when I approached him many years later, he contributed music from his back catalog, and he also organized a really incredible group of musicians to create new music for the film. If you just tuned in, it's me, Bobby Friction, here on BBC Radio London. I was talking to the critically acclaimed director, Vivek Bald, who's still on the line, live from the United States of America. And we were talking about his current movie, In Search of Bengali Harlem, which is getting its first show in Britain at Rich Mix in East London on the 8th of November, I think is the right date. So, Vivek, just to carry on with this, so you mentioned the music, you mentioned the composers, you've mentioned that very unique flex in terms of South Asian diaspora history, which is essentially lots of men coming over, whether it was, Bengali men or Punjabi men or Gujarati men, that time in the early 20th century, and they were ending up marrying locals for various reasons, including legislation brought in, racist legislation even brought in the United States of America and Canada. In the notes for the documentary, and you've kind of hinted at this, obviously Harlem, New York, when I think about New York and hip hop, I think about breakdancing, I think about the Fight the Power video, with Public Enemy. How big an influence is hip hop in this documentary, or is it just the soundtrack? Well, I would say it's a huge influence in the sense that the film centers on Alaudin, who was formed really in the fire of early hip hop. He was sneaking out of his apartment to watch some of the earliest hip hop MCs performing at a park that was just a block away from his apartment building, his place in the projects, and he just, you'll see in the film, he embodies hip hop. He's like a product of hip hop, and that's why he himself talks about how improbable it was that he ultimately, in pursuit of questions about his parents in this film, made his way back to Noakhali, to his parents' villages. You see in the film both this sense of dislocation and reconnection of this hip-hop kid from New York in
these Bengali villages where he hasn't seen his cousins and aunts since he was 8 years old. And there's something very powerful about that reunion that then is explored in the last section of the film, and particularly in relation to him understanding his mother's story as one of the first women from rural Bangladesh to migrate to the U.S.
Okay, so look, this is brilliant. I'm so excited about this. I have no doubt there are listeners right now who want to know where, when and how, and I can give that information, and I will do that in a second. But I have one last question for you now that you're online, and time's running out, so just bear that in mind. I have to ask this. Trump's America is currently, in iteration 2. You have a race for the mayor of New York, which involves a American Muslim South Asian brother running for that position. Plus, also, let's think about the documentary: the Bengali community, the South Asian community, the Black community, the Latin community in New York. What's New York feeling like for people of color specifically? In your opinion?
I think there's a sense of excitement that an excitement about local politics that hasn't existed for a long time, and we will see in just about a week if what we all believe will happen, and it will be really an amazing new chapter in the city's history and in the country's history.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Vivek Bald. It's been an absolute joy having you on. For those listening at home, In Search of Bengali Harlem, the documentary that we've been talking about, from award-winning Vivek Bald, is on the 8th of November at Rich Mix in East London. It's on at 5:30 p.m, so if you're working, you can still get there post-work. And not only is the documentary being shown, also there's going to be a question and answer with the filmmakers. And on top of that, a post-screening event with some daytimer DJs with food and drinks and everything that I love in this world. Thank you very much, Vivek.
Sure thing. All right.